Hello, I'm Marcus Lowth, and welcome to UFO Insight In-Depth, the show where we explore all aspects and details of the UFO and alien question, as well as some of the most intriguing and thought-provoking UFO cases. Now, today we're going to explore an alleged UFO crash in the United States in the mid-1960s, and whether there are any connections to one of the most unsettling conspiracies of the Second World War, an apparent wonder weapon of the Third Reich. Now, we'll begin in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, a small town around 30 miles south of Pittsburgh. And the events of December 9th, 1965, have all the hallmarks of a Hollywood movie. Now, on the night in question, multiple residents witnessed a fireball-like object zipping through the sky. And because of the zigzag motion and the way it moved this way and that way, they knew they weren't witnessing a meteorite. They knew it was something a little more out of the ordinary than that. Now, they continued to watch, and the object descended and eventually crashed into a clearing in the nearby woods. Now, within minutes of the apparent crash, residents, as well as members of the Kecksburg Volunteer Fire Service, were at the scene. And what they could see, what they recalled seeing buried in the dirt, was a distinct acorn or bell-shaped object. Now, it appeared to be metallic in nature and metallic exterior, and they estimated it was around the size of a small car. Strangest of all, though, around the bottom section were strange symbols that appeared very similar, according to the reports, to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, the next thing the witnesses realised, there was an intense military presence at the scene, as if this unit had appeared out of nowhere. And we might imagine that they certainly had prior awareness or knowledge of the object. It was said that it travelled over 6 states, so they were likely tracking it for some time. Now, this military presence, they immediately took control. They cordoned off the area, and they essentially urged people to forget everything they had seen, as if nothing had happened. Now, a short time after this, an official report was released, and it stated that although a search of the area had taken place, the military unit had found nothing of consequence. Essentially, they were saying that nothing out of the ordinary happened. Now, as we might imagine, considering the number of witnesses, many of whom had actually made their way to the crash site, this version of events was difficult for some people to accept. Some people even reported seeing military flatbed trucks removing objects, one of which was apparently distinctly bell-shaped. And now, even more suspicious, the Tribune newspaper ran a story that a UFO had indeed crashed in the woods the following day. The day after that, however, they released another story, and this time they completely retracted what they'd said. They claimed that the account was inaccurate and that nothing out of the ordinary had taken place that night in Kecksburg. Now, to some, though, it was clear that some kind of cover-up was in motion. Now, one of those people who believed there was indeed a cover-up taking place was John Murphy. Now, he was a news reporter and a radio host for WHJB Radio. Not only did he visit the crash site on the night in question, he also managed to take several photographs. Now, obviously, when the military arrived, they confiscated his rolls of film, but he did manage to conceal one of them. He showed these pictures when he had them developed to his manager, Michael Mazza. Now, he would later corroborate to investigators that he did indeed see these pictures. And what he said was that although they were grainy and dark, he could definitely make out an object that was distinctly cone or bell-shaped. Now, Murphy became quite obsessed with the case. He would speak to anybody he could who claimed to have seen the crash or was at the crash site. And he eventually began to put together a radio show titled Object in the Woods. And this was signed off by his manager, and it was due to air very shortly after he commissioned it. Now, only days before the show was due to be broadcast, 2 men dressed in dark suits arrived at the radio station. And they insisted on speaking to Murphy. And what's more, they wanted to speak to him alone. Now, their arrival was corroborated by another employee at the radio station, a lady called Linda Fauchier. She later offered the 2 men, they took Murphy into one of the side rooms, again insistent that they spoke with him alone, and they were there with him for around about half an hour. Now, nobody knows what was said, but when they did leave, they took with them several audio tapes, files that we might imagine were for the show, and perhaps crucially, they also removed several photographs. Now, the show did air, but both Mazza and Murphy's wife later attested to investigators that the show was nothing at all like the original version he had planned. Whatever was said, it was sufficient enough for Murphy to alter the show drastically. Now, those who knew Murphy stated that he became extremely agitated and even withdrawn following the encounter with the two mysterious gentlemen. We might consider, given their actions, given their appearance, given the apparent threats, and claims of working for the government, that these men were basically what we would recognize as the Men in Black. What they said to Murphy, as I say, is open to debate, but he certainly felt moved enough to alter the format of his show. And we've got to remember, he was specifically obsessed with this incident and convinced that a cover-up was in place. We might imagine whatever was said, the threats could have involved imprisonment or perhaps even violence. We might also consider, though, that these mystery gentlemen perhaps just revealed some major truth about UFOs to Murphy, and that perhaps forced him to reassess his stance. Now, either of these scenarios could explain his apparent anxious state in the years that followed, but of more concern are the circumstances surrounding his death in February 1969. Now, he was on holiday with his family at the time in California, and it appeared very much that he was the target of a purposeful hit-and-run collision. The driver appeared to pick him out, he didn't stop his vehicle, and whoever did run him down remains a complete mystery. Now, whether Murphy's death was connected to the Kecksburg UFO crash and his own investigations into it remains unknown. And of course, officially, nothing out of the ordinary took place in Kecksburg that night in December 1965. However, given the number of witnesses, as well as the albeit brief newspaper coverage, it would appear that something, whatever it was, something out of the ordinary did indeed take place that evening. Now, while some insist that the object was indeed a UFO, essentially a crashed vehicle from another world, others put forward that the object could simply be a failed Soviet space probe. We might imagine, though, if this was the case, that the authorities would have made much more about having recovered it. Some people suggest that the incident was some kind of military experimental aircraft, and we'll come back to this notion shortly because that could be of importance. First, though, we will turn our attention to the final months of the Second World War in Europe and an apparent wonder weapon of the Third Reich. Now, in 2000, Polish researcher and writer Igor Witkowski released the book The Truth About the Wonder Weapon. Now, in it, he would offer that towards the end of the war, the Third Reich were actively developing a wonder weapon, something that the world had never seen before, and something that would change the course of the war. Now, Witkowski would state that he was given access to the secret documents of former Third Reich officer Jacob Sporenberg. And he said he was given access to these papers through an anonymous source in the Polish intelligence services. Now, while he was given permission to read these and translate the files for his own notes, and indeed use the information that he saw there, he was not allowed to remove any copies, and he wasn't allowed to make any direct copies of them. Now, according to what he read, this wonder weapon, named Die Glocke, or the Bell, was developed at a facility called Delice in Poland near the Czech border. Now, although the Bell was housed underground, during live experiments, it was said to float into the air, and it had to be chained in place to a concrete structure called the henge, and that's what you're looking at right here. Now, this structure does exist, it's still there, and this picture was taken a couple of decades ago, so the area is now much more overgrown, but you can get there. It just takes it just takes a bit of a walk into the wilderness, but the structure does exist. Now, whether it existed for the purpose that Witkowski claims is open to debate. Now, the Glocke, or the Bell, as its name indicated, was bell-shaped. It was around 15 feet high, and it measured around 9 feet across. It was made from hard and heavy metal. Strangest of all, though, around the base were strange hieroglyphic-type symbols. Now, we might remind ourselves that many people who saw the crashed UFO at Kecksburg, not only was it shaped similar to a bell, but they also claimed to see ancient Egyptian-like hieroglyphics around its base. Now, according to Witkowski, Die Glocke used an anti-gravity technology consisting of two rotating cylinders. And these cylinders were filled with a mercury-like substance named Cerium 525. And this substance, quite volatile it would appear, was stored in tall, thin thermos flasks, and each of these were lined with lead. Now, when activated, there was an effect zone of around 200 meters around Die Glocke, and what's more, anything within this zone was greatly affected. According to what Witkowski read, blood would gel and separate in this zone, and crystals would form in animal tissue, and this would happen fast. Plants and vegetation, on the other hand, equally rapidly, would decompose, and they would eventually turn into what Witkowski described as a grease-like substance. Perhaps as a testament to how volatile these experiments with Die Glocke actually were. Of the 7 original scientists who began working on the project, only 2 survived. 5 would lose their lives during the testing process. Now, perhaps strangest and most intriguing of all, though, when Die Glocke was active, on the interior was a mirror-like material, and on this mirror-like material, it was said that you could see visions of the past and the future. And even more remarkable still, when it was programmed a certain way, Die Glocke was said to have the ability to bend space and time. Essentially, it was some kind of time machine. Now, it is perhaps interesting now to briefly explore another apparent top-secret device. This one is said to be in the archives of the Vatican, the Chronovisor. Now, it is worth mentioning that although accounts of this device first appeared in the wider public arena in 2002 in the book The Vatican's New Mystery, an intriguing article appeared in an Italian newspaper as far back as 1972, as you can see here. And this headline reads, "A machine that photographs the past has finally been invented." Now, according to the article, in the 1950s, an Italian physicist who became a priest in his later life, Father Anetti, was commissioned by the Vatican to create this device. Now, it was composed entirely of precious alloys, and it utilized a screen that connected to tubes and tuning dials. Now, while the Chronovisor was not a time machine in the sense that it would transport a person literally back to the past or to the future, it did allow those who used it to see moments in time, predominantly from the past, but also apparently the very near future. And it did this by utilizing the residual electromagnetic radiation left over from numerous processes, although Anetti did not detail what these processes were. Furthermore, this energy that was released allowed the device to detect the frequencies and energies in space-time, and it would almost transpose them onto the device so you could be viewed like a film. Now, it's worth mentioning that at least one of those people who was said to have advised Anetti was one-time Third Reich scientist Werner von Braun. And we'll come back to von Braun in a little more detail shortly, but we have to ask, given his apparent assistance to Anetti, was the Chronovisor, if indeed it did exist, was it using the same basic technology as Die Glocke, which we might recall, according to the leaked papers at least, did allow people to see visions of the past? It's certainly worth keeping in mind. I mean, you might imagine that Die Glocke did exactly the same thing. Even more mind-blowing was Die Glocke a time machine, and did the Third Reich plan on using it to win the war? And we'll come back to these points very shortly. But at this point, it's worth our time going back 10 years earlier, to 3 years before the start of the Second World War, in the Black Forest near Freiburg in Germany. Now, according to some reports, one evening in the summer of 1936, a disc or saucer-shaped object crashed into the forest. Now, ultimately, it was recovered, it is said, by SS troops and then transported to Third Reich headquarters. Now, it is claimed that German scientists and engineers immediately began looking to reverse engineer the technology that they had retrieved. And some claims even state that this technology was used to develop the Haunebu disc, an alleged vehicle that is said to use, once more, anti-gravity technology. We will examine very shortly the fact that many German scientists and engineers would go on to continue their work in the United States following the end of the Second World War. But given the descriptions of the Haunebu disc, to many objects witnessed in the years since the start of the modern UFO era, we might consider whether its development discreetly continues in America following the end of World War II. Now, one last thing to mention here about the alleged Black Forest incident is in 2013, an intriguing article appeared online, and while we should treat this with a pinch of salt, it did make some thought-provoking claims. Now, the author of the article claimed to have channeled to the crash site in 1936, and he claimed he'd achieved this by tracking down and obtaining a pair of field glasses that were worn by an SS officer that was at the scene that night. Of most interest, the writer of the article offered that the object was not a spacecraft from another world. He said it was in fact a time machine, and what's more, it had a human crew who were all shot on sight. Now, if there's any truth to Witkowski's account of Die Glocke, might we consider that it could have been developed from the alleged recovered technology from the UFO crash in the Black Forest? And might that technology have been related to time travel? And if so, could that technology have eventually ended up in the hands of the Allies and ultimately the Americans? Well, quite possibly, yes, it could. Following the defeat of the Third Reich and the liberation of Europe, leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union quickly came to a realization. They realized that many scientists and engineers of the Third Reich were likely to be poached by one side or the other. And with this in mind, the two countries entered into a race of sorts to essentially bag the finest scientific minds of the Third Reich. Now, the American side of this was named Operation Paperclip, and they wasted little time, the Americans, in recruiting some of the finest German scientific minds to continue their work for the United States. And they contained some notable names as well, perhaps most notably Werner von Braun, who was not only a leading scientist in the rocket developments of the Third Reich, but through Operation Paperclip, he went on to lead the United States essentially to the moon through his work with NASA. So we might ask, did the Americans, as part of Operation Paperclip, also seize Die Glocke and continue to develop it? And was the object that crashed in the woods in Kecksburg the result of that development? Certainly an interesting point. And at this point, we might also consider what happened to the leader of the Die Glocke project, Hans Kammler. Was he taken to the United States secretly as part of Operation Paperclip? Or did, as Igor Witkowski claims, he escaped to South America along with Die Glocke itself? Most sources suggest that Kammler had agreed to defect to the United States before the end of the war, and given his high rank, his presence would likely have been kept hidden. But could the truth be even more mind-blowing? Might Hans Kammler have used Die Glocke itself to disappear? Now, ultimately, was Die Glocke a time machine? And did Kammler and possibly other Third Reich members escape 2 decades into the future, with Die Glocke crashing down into the woods in Kecksburg in December 1965? Now, of course, such a notion is preposterous to some. But why, for example, if Die Glocke could travel through time, had the Third Reich not used it to travel back and somehow turn the war in their favour? Well, perhaps they would have if they could. But given the outcome of the war, we have to assume that they were unsuccessful in travelling back in time and certainly not in altering the course of history. But could there be another possibility? Could it be that Die Glocke was only able to travel forward? As bizarre as this might sound, this was something that even Einstein contemplated. According to his research and speculative theories, traveling forward in time would seem to be far easier than traveling to the past. Now, in its most basic terms, this is simply due to the fact that to travel to the past, you would need to bend space-time itself. And while it was said that Die Glocke did indeed have the capability to bend space and time, we might assume that German engineers and scientists were unable to perfect this to the level of being able to literally transport a person back to the past. Going forward, however, at least in theory, would require that we simply travel faster than light so that time slows down around us. And as such, we are transported into the future, at least based on Einstein's famous theory. Now, if either of the previous scenarios are true, then it would be shattering for our history and our collective reality. Ultimately, Is Die Glocke and the crashed UFO at Kecksburg in 1965 one and the same thing? Was it a vehicle that was developed from the designs of Die Glocke? And perhaps Die Glocke itself, which then crashed to the ground during experimental operations, is what we know as the Kecksburg UFO? Or, as we have just looked at, could it be that the Kecksburg UFO arrived from 20 years in the past, perhaps containing high-ranking members of the Third Reich? Or was whatever came down a genuine vehicle from another world? And if so, just what happened to the apparent ruins that were confiscated by the military? Are they being reverse engineered somewhere secretly, even still today? And if the Kecksburg UFO was a vehicle from another world, then what should we make of the claims of Die Glocke, the bell? Was it a potential time machine, and where might it reside today? Is it possible that some secret government agency had possession of this advanced equipment, and could they be experimenting with it today in attempts to conquer the complexities of time travel? We should perhaps think, how would we even know if someone did go back to the past and alter the present? Now, we would think such alterations would cause events to change instantly without us being aware that it has even happened. So how do we know this hasn't happened on multiple occasions? Now, of course, this is all speculation, and rampant speculation at that. Perhaps one of the biggest questions we should ask is, did Die Glocke even exist? And if it did, was it much less along in its experimentation phase than the alleged secret papers suggested? It certainly gives us all a lot to think about. I hope you enjoyed our talk here today, and until next time, goodbye and take care.